Welcome to this special appendix edition of Total Network Operations, where we're going to have a focused conversation about DevOps. Of course, we all know exactly what DevOps means and exactly how to implement it and how it's so uniformly implemented across many organizations. I'm lying. If I were Pinocchio, my nose would be growing toward the camera. Let's dive into this a little bit and talk about the folks that come from the real sysadmin and development world versus the networking side. How do you start? What's the fit? Is there lightweight ways to apply this traditional network engineering shops? Let me stop being prescriptive and we'll go from there.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it starts off with what you're managing.
Let me pause right there. William, can you give us a good, concise definition of DevOps?
Yes. So DevOps is so if you look at the traditional world, kind of like, change orders, adding things to change orders, logging into CLIs, doing all these things, as technology's evolved, you had, Agile come along. Agile from waterfall really flipped over application development. And then DevOps sort of came along and DevOps days and a lot of hype and synergy. But what it is at the end of the day is with the gigantic influx of the amount of changes that cloud and, coming out of your own data center sort of put on the industry, DevOps is a culture. It is a culture for making changes. It's not a tool. It's not a pipeline service. It's not GitHub. It's not any of those things. Those are things that help you drive DevOps. But DevOps can mean many different things for many different organizations, and it depends on that organization. But really, the common theme is highly automated. Instead of like ITIL change management, you have multi-stage pipelines that span many categories of infrastructure. It might be network, it might be compute, it might be database. But you have, whether you're using like infrastructure as code, pick your tool or your poison, it shouldn't matter, but you're highly automated. It's not hands-on and injecting, okay, we automated this thing, now we're logging in to do that, and then now we can kick off this thing.
But that's how I've always done it.
Exactly. That is how most of us have always done it. And that's a really hard thing is, mature DevOps organizations actually don't allow you to log into a cloud console and make changes within the cloud console. They actually lock that down. So imagine not being able to log into your Cisco router because you have something else that's sort of running the show and you're just committing code, you're triggering a pipeline and it's running. But the purpose of that is with that influx of all these changes, it is so much easier to inject configuration drift that spans your environment. And we know that once something's out there, it's really hard to reel it back in. It takes time, effort, and a mountain of people and, executive buy-in. It's a heavy lift.
I believe you, but I want to come back to that. Eyvonne, would you modify, add on?
No, I think William's done a pretty good summary there. I think for those of us who have operationally run environments with our hands on the actual gear, it is unnerving to think about handing over control of that.
Unnerving, yeah, and then some.
And I've been really. I discovered Gall's law recently, and Gall's law says that a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. And I think what happens is we see these highly evolved organizations that have implemented developer practices in their operations. And we're like, oh, we want to do that, and we want to do all of that, and we want to do all of that now. Instead of stepping back and saying, okay, where's a good place for us to start to incorporate this new way of thinking about how to operationalize our environment? Because frankly, some of the systems that we have and that we are currently maintaining don't lend themselves well to a DevOps style approach There is no API. We're doing screen scraping to do configuration, and the benefit may not be worth the effort to go back and retrofit all of those things. And you may be introducing errors into the environment. So I think if an organization says something like, we want to go full DevOps, well, first, what's that mean? And second, like, what's the benefit that we're getting from that? Or is it just the new cool thing that all the CTOs are talking about? And we think it will, in some vague, amorphous way, make things better. I think you've got to start nailing those things down and understand why you're doing what you're doing. But I will say it's very important. Read the Agile Manifesto. Understand the philosophy that's driving the movement, and then it will help you map that to your organization and your environment. That was a lot to say. I agree with William.
No.
But I agree with William.
That's all good. And there are a couple things. I heard you. What was the law you just cited?
Gall's Law.
GALL.
Yeah.
I expect that in the show notes.
That's very good. And when I heard you mention that recently elsewhere, I'm not attributing it, as I just can't remember where. The first thing I thought of was, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Yep.
So as a corollary,
Yeah.
So I will not replace the law, as it were. But I like your counsel on go and read the Agile Manifesto and figure out how it applies to your organization. I think there is a coolness factor where people get enamored with, this is the hot newness that is coming from the software world, and we know that software eats the world, so it must be something I need to do in my organization, and it's not necessarily so.
Well, I mean, Nicole Forsgren released that fabulous book years ago, Accelerate, where she studied high-performing software organizations, and she strongly made the point that speed of execution actually can be an indicator of resilience and reliability.
Right.
That this paradigm that we've built, that moving slow means we're more stable, is a fallacy. And I believe that for a lot of people, that's what's driving the move to DevOps, but they never say it out loud. And so they don't think through where that makes sense in their environment and where it doesn't. So where is it that we can implement a bunch of small changes that are individually relatively low risk, where we can build a system that makes sense in a simpler way, and then expand it out to more complex environments. But if you're going to take a complex methodology and just try and slap it on the complexity that you already have, there's not some sort of a large wave dynamic that's actually going to cancel one another out. Right. You're just going to end up with a lot more complexity and a lot more instability.
So one of the big motivators for me in starting down the road on TNOps was listening to John Willis at AutoCon 0 last year, who comes out of the DevOps movement. And it was really refreshing to have somebody come in as a keynote who was not necessarily a network automation person, talk to the whole audience. And, my undergraduate background is in industrial engineering, manufacturing, process engineering, and hearing John Willis talk about W. Edwards Deming, a statistical process control guru from the 1930s into the 1980s, and him talking about the things like implementing small changes, treating everything like a small experiment, and then learning from those small experiments and working them back in. And as I've seen DevOps gain all this momentum and in some ways be forced down the throats of people in traditional network engineering organizations, my thought was, how can we take those basic principles and reapply them to traditional network engineering shops in ways that make sense? Like, maybe making everybody use Git isn't the right thing to do. Maybe it is, right? I'm just picking on Git for a little bit here. But,
well, and I think it's going to start, frankly, with your procurement, right? If
Wait, your business drivers are important? Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that there are there are certain types of gear that are going to be more that are going to fit better into a DevOps model than others. And again, so you got to say, okay, where do we want to get to? And if it is, yes, we have 1,000 facilities and we want to be able to make a change across those 1,000 facilities over the course of 24 hours, not 6 months.
Right.
Lofty goal, noble, important, high business value. Right. So it's a good thing to do. What do we need to have in place to be able to do those things? And maybe that means we start with one site where we develop a new model. We deploy that. We procure a different kind of gear that's going to allow us to interact with it programmatically. And we build a itty bitty baby precious new pipeline. And we care and we feed that thing and then we grow it up, right? And then we expand that model. But to me, that's the way to approach it, to have real meaningful change. It's not a big flashy project. It's not super sexy, and you're not going to get millions of dollars of gear to do that initially. But that's how you start any meaningful change.
Sure. That was like almost poetic. That was beautiful.
Not almost, but let's say that it was.
Yeah. So to that point, if you work somewhere and they're saying, hey, we're going to institute DevOps in 8 months, you already failed. That's not, it's the true meaning of a journey. It's a culture, right? It's not a program. It's not like tied by this much budget. Like it's culture. And one thing starting off is if you start off the right way, it's not easy and it's not fast, because one of the things that I've learned over the latter part of my career is you can't, right now, you have to be able to justify that what you're doing is going to get money in the future. You have to be able to prove some sort of return on investment. And the only way to do that is with data. So you have to, before you just start making changes and throwing things everywhere, you have to understand how to measure what it is that you're doing.
Yep.
If you can measure something, it's the perfect starting point. You have to be able to measure. So then you can say, okay, this set of engineers that had this task, well, in this chart, they were doing this many mouse clicks and this was the process to just add a VLAN and, set up just something, whatever it is that you're doing. But then you can say, okay, now with this process in place, this is what it looks like. But you have to have the hard data. You can't just say, oh, it's automated. We DevOps this, pack it up, let's go. That's never going to work. You talk and play by the corporate system to some degree.
Well, the only caveat I have is if you have a leader that comes to you and says, hey, I'm excited about this DevOps idea and I want to start a DevOps program and I want to have it everywhere. You don't go, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because William on the podcast said that wasn't going to work.
You can cite him. Who's William? Him.
Yeah. But what you can say is, wow, interesting. I have an idea for where we can start. And then you guide the conversation to how to break that problem down and say, okay, well, we've got this site that's up for refresh in 6 months. How do we start there and build a thing that we can build on? And so a lot of times, if a practitioner will step in with their expertise and say, yes, I've read about it. I think that's interesting. We could do some great things here. Now let's talk about where to start, as opposed to just, yeah, that's a dumb idea and it's never going to work here, which is how I've seen so many of us respond in a situation like that.
And sometimes you may fail too. So you may give your feedback and, your leader's going to come back down and say, no, we're doing this anyway. And you can scream and you can cry, you can jump and shout. Well, don't do any of that. But, moving on,
just won't matter.
Even though you know that this thing is going to fail and you may devote 6 months to executing this thing, sometimes you just have to roll with the punches. But then you can come out the other end and say, hey, we learned something. These were the learnings, and this is why we need to do X, Y, and Z. Got to get a little political, House of Cards type stuff.
No, any organizational change requires leadership. right? And that can be formal leadership and it can be informal leadership for sure. Let's talk about some specific constructs and ideas. And I don't want to sound like I'm here to trash DevOps, because I'm not. I'm just trying to figure out, how do we apply it to traditional network engineering environments and shops where all this process heavy stuff is a lot, right? If I think about the idea of like radical collaboration, you're having people write code and check code and have automated testing. That's wise. That makes sense to me. But we're not talking about developing software here. We're talking about network device configs. Does that pose an important difference in any ways that either of you can think of?
Go ahead, Eyvonne. You first.
I should have pointed at you earlier. No, I think we often get hung up on what's code, what's not code. I don't know that anybody in IT, there have been batch files since there was DOS.
Sure.
Right? And it is not code, but it is certainly writing down a list of commands to execute in a certain order.
It's I think we can call that code. It's a set of instructions. Right?
And so I think we need to remove some of the mystery around it. And here's the thing. There are so many tools now to help with the code part. The actual hard part is, what are the dependencies? What do we need to do in what order? And how can we do that reliably every time?
Right.
And that's how we need to think about how we build things. Because if there's, we've got this special requirement at this one facility, with this one thing, and it requires us to build the system differently, that is a bigger barrier than any of those other things. So how do we narrow our environment down, create an infrastructure that is repeatable and that is consistent? Because that's really the challenge for network engineering, and why this has always been so difficult is because we've built snowflakes for a few decades, and and there's no way to easily unwind the kind of monster of our own making.
Yeah, to add on that, so I was actually going to take that direction with a few of those things as well. That was perfect. And I'll add on, so I gave a talk at Ansible Fest many years ago on this. So a lot of times when I would sit with network engineers that are trying to deploy or like figure out the automation thing, they want to say, okay, like we have a VLAN. Okay, we're just going to automate, okay, everything looking through the lens of that single VLAN. And maybe this port configuration or this, but one thing that makes a lot of sense, and one thing that you'll get a lot of cues from leadership, like, oh, that's good, is what are you trying to do? So case in point, this talk that I gave at Ansible Fest came from this, we were migrating a lot of applications to the cloud. Okay, well, what was a pattern on the network that was done every single time we migrated an application to the cloud? And when you started to break it down, it was like, okay, we have a route on our internal network and our data centers we own. We have to change a little bit of routing there. And then we go up to we were in a colo provider. And in that colo provider, we had a new prefix list that would get created. We'd have a few prefixes added. We had a route map that needed some tweaking. It was just a consistent thing. And then we had the layer 2 connect from the colo to the cloud. And then within the cloud, since this was like a net new thing, the way that we were structured at the time, each one of these new things actually correlated to a line of, not line of business, it was more like a department that managed the app. So you would have to create the cloud network, you'd have to create the subnets, but it was like all these things were the same every time. So like, okay, how do we speed this up? So as we broke down this sort of complicated process into individual things, we set up the testing was not great at that point. This is a while back, but each one of these little things, we would have a playbook, a repeatable playbook that we had committed to source control. I was actually using, the original NetBox for source of truth, pulling all that data in. And so we'd actually put something in NetBox that would actually trigger the pipeline to run. So we weren't actually doing pull requests at that point, which it did get, we did get to the point to having everything in version control, everything, the triggers, the pipelines, all the things. So you have ephemeral runners that get spun up.
Right.
And those they, pull the code in, they execute the changes, and then, they spin themselves back down. Very ephemeral. And that was the North Star, which we did get to, but we had to start somewhere.
Right.
And you're not going to start, if you just keep doing these things manually and you don't hit the pause button and say, hey, we can save a lot of time and this is how, it would have never worked. And having the whole thing in place and also being able to demonstrate it. So I had sandboxes with sandbox with the physical gear. So I actually had access to a bunch of Cisco ASRs, firewalls. We had a physical sandbox, and then we had our virtual sandbox accounts in the cloud. So we were really able to prototype this in a I would say no risk scenario and prove that it worked. And if I wouldn't have had those sandboxes and the ability to do that at the time, this would have never happened.
Sure. Thinking so to answer my question, and you kind of got there, it's really immaterial whether this is development of code or router configs. You didn't say that explicitly, but forgive me for putting words in your mouth.
It's a good summary.
Yeah, that seems rational to me, and I think any traditional network engineer would understand that for sure. Now, we talk about source code management and pipelines. Let's dig into that. I forced William to give the last definitions, but for the source code management discussion, hey, we run rancid grabs of configs on every device every hour on key devices, every 4 times a day on the other devices. We have backups. We're good. What does that not do compared to what modern source code management does, like GitHub?
Well, ultimately, you need to know what's our source of truth, right? There are two different things, especially when you're talking about networking. There's your running config and your state, and those are two different things,
yep.
Right? And so you need to know, especially if you're working on a team with other human beings, you need to have a commonly agreed upon source of truth.
I configured it. It's in the router. That's what's true.
The famous last words if I've ever heard.
That's what is. It's not necessarily what's best, right? And so, and you probably saw in my face a visceral response.
Those who are only listening, that's right. It's like that was in the air.
And so, and not only do you have this is our source of truth of what ought to be, you have the historical record of what that's looked like over time, what changes were made. If you're making comments the way that you need to be, then you also hopefully have a narrative around why those changes were made. And then you can go back, and if you need to do an RCA, why was this change made? Oh, wait, what does the running config match our source of truth? If it doesn't, then you start asking why. But without that, then the whole house of cards is going to crumble, because you have to know what the source of truth is, and it has to be in a centralized location that's commonly agreed upon, that we are all working from. And that really is the point of your source control system, whether it's for configuration or whether it's for code. You don't ever trust the developer laptop, right?
Works on my machine.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. One of the other overarching things here, I think that's bigger than the tools that are used in the actual method, are obviously that source of truth has to come from a design and an architecture, right? So it's all got to flow down from how we think it should all be instantiated. And I think there's really good reasons to think about architecture into engineering deployment into operations and maintenance. Those are 3 real layers in my view. But there is this other side of engineering workflows and dependencies that you both have mentioned. And I think about, like, I've just started calling it an operations architect, somebody who knows what those dependencies are, not just from well, if I configure this on this branch router, I'm going to need this on, its home run router first, and being able to drive that into automations, right? And I feel like there's a good place for a role. I don't care what you call it, but operations architect is the name I'm giving the role, whether that's somebody's full-time job or a hat somebody wears. What do you react to that?
So stuff like that has been tried in the past in different ways. So the two ways that I've seen that attempted, at least, is first of all, you have a separate, so in a bigger the company, the more likely this is, because you're bigger, you're more matrixed.
Right.
You got a lot more people. So you have a separate part of the organization that maybe doesn't sit under the core IT, like your shared services organization, that is like enterprise architecture. And I've always seen the challenge there is they'll have specializations under the enterprise architecture arm, but they're not in the weeds, they're not in the technical stuff, and it's the value that they can provide there. Like, they'll have this broad sweeping, everything should be this. And as we know, when you're in the weeds and you have the architecture on the real architecture on your shoulders, sometimes it's not that easy. And that is hit or miss. But then I also see domain architects, and not in the sense of, Active Directory domains, but just a domain, a specific area of technology that maybe sits closer to the technical practitioners and tries to, they're almost like very technical project managers sometimes that are more embedded.
Sure.
And sometimes, this works, but again, too many cooks in the kitchen, you run into problems as well. So I don't know if you have any thoughts there, Eyvonne.
Well, I don't think you have to choose an organizational structure, and then you have to put culture in place to balance out your organizational structure. If you have a separate group of enterprise architects that all work together on a team, you have to have mechanisms to force those people to stay connected to the day-to-day work, or they will sit in their ivory tower and they will create diagrams that only vaguely represent your infrastructure. Or you put those people in separate teams, and maybe it's a team lead, maybe it's a role inside of a particular subject matter domain, but then you have to create a mechanism for all of those people to collaborate with one another. I mean, there is no one way to do it, and either way you do it organizationally has got downsides, and then you have to push against the inertia of your organization to actually have it function well, which is why the culture is, and that's why William keeps talking about that cultural piece, and it's so important. But the last thing that you want is a layer of enterprise architects who have to approve everything that gets done, but don't really understand how any of it works. And William's grinning because we have both seen that in real life and have felt the pain of what that inflicts on the people that are actually hands on keyboard.
Well, we often encourage it too, because sometimes those people come from hands-on roles in the past, and
it's a new career ladder.
It's absolutely a way out of, not carrying the pager anymore, right? Or however the kids do it today. Sorry, the early in career. So it's you can lose touch. Right. And my ideal for an operations architect is somebody who's part of the operations organization, tied to and works maintenance windows, is compensated, by metrics, at least in part, for operational excellence, if you will, and, is beholden there. So,
yeah, that would be a great responsibility for that role, would really be like almost like a translator, taking and Yeah, I've seen it happen all too frequently where you have, the whole DevOps theory of, oh, just going to throw it over at ops and, but then there's also this whole you build it and you operate it thing, which does not scale really for larger companies. But yeah, like having that person be the translator from the engineering and understand the pains and be almost like a feedback loop. So you have ops doing their thing. They have problems and maybe, usually ops folks, you do have some seasoned ops folks that have been around for a while, but a lot of times the ops teams I've worked on, you have a lot of new people and they may not know that something is actually a problem. They may just think that this is how it's supposed to work when it's not. So having somebody that can flag those things and have a feedback loop and give priority to some of those things would be helpful as well.
Well, and in a perfect world, that operations architect would also spend a certain amount of their time embedding with the engineering teams to provide engineering teams operations feedback into how the systems that they're designing will roll into operations once they're fully designed and implemented. But now we are just in Pollyanna unicorn dreamland.
Well,
You can always dream. We're all dreamers here.
Nightmares are dreams too, William. But Russ and I have talked about this a little bit, and he'll be on Teen Ops at some point in the future, where not only should that be a strong liaison function with engineering and architecture, but probably needs to be part of the architectural design. And that whole thought of designing and engineering for operations. How do I build this in a way that's going to be easy to maintain? Not just because I think segment routing is cool and my vendor is telling me I need to use it. I don't have any baggage there.
And to come full circle, that was part of the objective of DevOps, right? Is to bring those two domains, development, creation, design, closer to operations so that there wasn't this chasm between the two.
Yep. Great place to start winding this episode down. You gave some great practical advice earlier. Definitely go read the Agile Manifesto, understand what it means. What else would you tell traditional networking folks? How can you start getting more educated on DevOps and see what makes sense for your team?
Yeah, I don't know that it's any different than advice I've given in other arenas. That is, yes, read, understand what people are talking about, pay attention when they're talking because people will use the same words to mean very different things. And then also get familiar with some of the tooling. The tooling in and of itself is not DevOps, but it's like you don't build a house without a nail gun, right? And so if you want to, if your organization is moving in that direction, understand what pipeline tools are. Jenkins, get some experience with scripting, whether that's Python or Go or Terraform, depending on your environment. Get familiar with those things. You don't have to be an expert, but you at least need to have the vocabulary down enough to be a meaningful contributor to the conversation.
Yeah, totally agreed.
So I'm going to go in with a little bit of a highly contested viewpoint here.
Awesome.
And one thing I see, on the Twitters and LinkedIn sometimes it's like, oh, I really don't need to learn Linux, blah, 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 blah. Why do network engineers need to learn Linux? I don't understand. And first of all of your network gear is pretty much running on Linux. So when you need to get down in the shell and actually do things, it pays to know how to get around the file system, how to SCP, how to script some of this stuff together. But when you get into DevOps land, I haven't met a lot of proficient DevOps folks that didn't have a good understanding of Linux, because Bash scripting is the glue in these pipelines that does a lot of the small things. You say that you have that ephemeral build agent I was talking about earlier. You spin up a build agent. Well, that's running Linux. You need to install things on that build agent. You need to do a few things to get it ready for the infrastructure you're going to deploy. Now, you may have packaged images that already have these things on them. I mean, there's just so many ways to do it. But at the end of the day, you are going to run across a lot of things that are very easily solved by having a little bit of Linux command line knowledge. It's not going to kill anybody. This is, to go back in my history, I was actually in high school at the time, and I had a back surgery, and I had a science experiment, which was installing Slackware on an old machine, and I fell in love with it. I'm like, this is actually really cool. What else am I going to do?
Slackware was my first distro too.
Yeah, I didn't know that. It's awesome. Sweet. Yeah, so doing that, just installing it, understanding the file systems, where to get to things, elevating your permission, like all that stuff is really good stuff to know that is useful across network engineering, DevOps, everything. Because Linux powers the world pretty much.
Yeah.
Powers the internet.
And just like we've said elsewhere, learning Linux is not costly.
And it's not hard.
That's right. And
I would consider it a fundamental. Like when we sit here and we say learn fundamentals, it is as important to have a basic operating understanding of Linux as it is to be able to do a packet walk or to understand TCP or to know how to subnet. Like that, I will go on record saying that. It is a fundamental. And if you want to be in technology in any kind of capacity, you have to have a working knowledge of Linux, period, full stop.
And to make it concrete for the network engineering community, look at the move from operating systems that were monolithic and didn't give you any internal capabilities to operating systems that were actually built on top of different Unix distros to operating systems that have now been re-engineered on top of Linux. And sometimes, your favorite TAC organization will tell you that's not supported. Well, you can shell out and go down into the Linux command line and learn all sorts of interesting stuff that you're not seeing from the NOS CLI. So totally amen to your dual recommendation on that. Well, again, thank you both. Do a quick, where's the best way to find you, William?
William-Collins on LinkedIn, WCollins502 on the Twitters or X, if that's what you like to call it.
TwitX.
Yeah, TwitX.
TwitX works for me.
And yeah, I host the Cloud Gambit podcast. We talk about a lot of tech adjacent to networking and a lot of networking as well. Eyvonne just recently decided to join me as co-host. So yeah, you can find more of us there.
Yeah, Eyvonne Sharp. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Eyvonne Sharp, and on Twitter at Sharp Network. The blog is esharp.net. And every couple weeks, you'll be hearing from me and William on the Cloud Gambit.
Looking forward to more Cloud Gambit episodes. That's a top of my list. I'm trying to retune my pod catcher. I was an Overcast guy, and the latest update of Overcast totally killed all my curation lists. So I'm back on Apple Podcasts now. We'll see how long that lasts. But I'm still getting the Cloud Gambit. That's all good.
You got to churn out a lot of episodes to catch up. We got a year head start on you, so you need to release twice a week until you catch up.
Twice a week. Oh, good idea. Well, I'll work on that. So thank you, listeners and watchers, for listening to another episode of TNOps. This is an ongoing project. I want feedback for what you want to hear, topics you want covered, people that you think would be great for us to talk with. This is one in a series of DevOps related conversations. Why am I having multiple conversations on this? Because it's a deep area and there are lots of different things to think about when adapting it to your organization, as you heard today. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn, and you can provide follow-up as well on packetpushers.net/follow-up. Thanks again. See you next time on TNOps.